I never imagined that moving into the pristine suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, would turn into a nightmare involving criminal charges, poisoned plants, and a woman whose sense of power had completely corrupted her judgment. But there I was, standing in my backyard on a Tuesday morning in late April, staring at my once thriving vegetable garden that now looked like something out of a horror movie. My name is Ethan Anderson, and I had bought my house in the Meadowbrook Springs development just 8 months earlier. At 34 years old, I was finally living the dream of homeownership after years of apartment living in downtown Charlotte. The house was a charming 3-bedroom colonial with a spacious backyard that got perfect sunlight for gardening. I had spent countless weekends that spring carefully cultivating tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, herbs, and even some decorative sunflowers along the fence line. Gardening had become my therapy after a stressful job as a software engineer, and watching things grow from tiny seeds into flourishing plants gave me a sense of accomplishment that coding never quite matched. The Homeowners Association had seemed reasonable enough when I first moved in. The monthly fees were standard, the neighborhood was well maintained, and the covenant guidelines seemed straightforward. I'd read through the entire packet before signing my closing documents. Nowhere in those rules did it say anything about vegetable gardens being prohibited. There were specifications about fence heights, exterior paint colors, and lawn maintenance, but gardens were only mentioned in terms of keeping them neat and weed-free. I had been meticulous about following every rule. My grass was always mowed to the specified height. My mailbox matched the approved style. I even repainted my shutters to match the exact shade listed in the covenant when I realized the previous owners had used a slightly different color. I wanted to be a good neighbor and a responsible homeowner. That all changed when Brenda Patterson became the HOA president 3 months ago. Brenda was exactly what you would picture when someone said HOA Karren. She was 52 years old with an asymmetrical blonde bob that she probably called edgy, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of athletic leisure wear despite never actually exercising. She drove a white BMW SUV with a Live Laugh Love sticker on the back window and had made it her personal mission to patrol the neighborhood, looking for violations from the moment she took office. I had my first encounter with Brenda about 6 weeks after she became president. I was outside watering my garden one Saturday morning when she pulled up in her SUV and got out, clipboard in hand. "Good morning," I said, trying to be friendly. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She ignored my greeting entirely and walked straight toward my backyard fence, peering over it with narrowed eyes. "Is that a vegetable garden?" "Yes, madam. I put it in back in March. The tomatoes are really taking off now that the weather's warmed up." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Vegetable gardens are not aesthetically pleasing and bring down property values. I felt my stomach tighten but kept my voice calm. I reviewed the HOA covenants thoroughly before planting. There's no restriction on vegetable gardens as long as they're maintained properly, which mine is. The covenants state that all landscaping must maintain the aesthetic standards of the community, she said, tapping her pen against her clipboard. Vegetable gardens are utilitarian, not decorative. The covenants also specifically mention that gardens should be kept weed-free and neat, which implies gardens are allowed. I countered. And I have decorative elements, too. The sunflowers along the fence, the stone border I installed, the wooden plant markers. It looks nice. Brenda's face flushed slightly. "I'll be bringing this up at the next board meeting. We may need to amend the covenants to clarify this matter." "That's fine," I said, though my heart was pounding. "But until there's an actual rule against it, I'll be keeping my garden." She gave me a look that could freeze water and got back in her SUV without another word. Over the next few weeks, I received 3 violation notices in the mail. The first claimed my garden was unsightly. The second said it violated the community aesthetic standards. The third threatened fines if I didn't remove it within 30 days. Each time I responded in writing, citing the specific covenant language that allowed gardens and requesting that the board point to any actual rule I was violating. I also attended the monthly HOA meeting where several other homeowners actually spoke up in support of my garden, saying they had walked by and thought it looked lovely. The board voted on Brenda's proposal to ban vegetable gardens, and it failed 3-2. 2 of the board members were avid gardeners themselves and saw no reason to restrict what people grew in their own yards. I thought that would be the end of it. I should have known better. 3 days after that board meeting, I woke up on a Tuesday morning and went out to water my garden before work. The moment I stepped into the backyard, I knew something was catastrophically wrong. The smell hit me first, a chemical odor that made my eyes water. Then, I saw the plants themselves. Everything was dying. The tomato plants that had been vibrant and loaded with green fruit were now drooping, their leaves curled and brown at the edges. The pepper plants looked like they had been torched. The zucchini leaves were spotted with yellow and black. My herbs were completely shriveled. Even the hardy sunflowers were wilting, their massive leaves hanging limp. I stood there in shock, my watering can dangling from my hand. This was not a disease. This was not pest damage. This was systematic destruction, and it had happened overnight. My first thought was vandalism, but my second thought was more calculated. I had installed security cameras around my property about a month earlier, not because of Brenda specifically, but because there had been a few car break-ins in the neighborhood and I wanted to protect my investment. I had 3 cameras, one covering the front door and driveway, one covering the side yard, and one covering the backyard that had a clear view of the garden. I abandoned the watering can and went straight inside, pulling up the security footage on my laptop. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the timeline from the previous night. There, at 2:47 a.m., the backyard camera had captured everything in crisp high definition with excellent night vision. I watched as a figure dressed in dark clothing climbed over my back fence. The person moved quickly and deliberately toward my garden, carrying what looked like 2 large jugs. For about 15 minutes, the figure methodically poured liquid over every single plant, making sure to saturate the soil around the roots. My pulse was racing as I zoomed in on the footage. The person's face was partially visible when they turned toward the house at one point, checking to see if anyone was watching. Even with the baseball cap pulled low, I could clearly make out the features. It was Brenda Patterson. I sat back from my laptop, my mind reeling. She had actually done this. She had committed a crime, trespassing on my property in the middle of the night to deliberately destroy my garden because she did not get her way at a HOA meeting. This was not just petty vandalism. This was poisoning vegetation with what I strongly suspected was herbicide or something even more toxic. I immediately made several copies of the video footage, saving it to my computer, an external hard drive, and uploading it to cloud storage. Then I called the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department's non-emergency line. The dispatcher listened to my story and sent an officer to my house within an hour. Officer Marcus Williams was a professional in his mid-30s who took detailed notes as I explained the situation and showed him both the destroyed garden and the security footage. That's definitely her, he said after watching the video 3 times. The footage is very clear. Do you know what substance she used? No idea, but it was effective. Everything is dead or dying, and I can still smell chemicals out there. Officer Williams walked out to the backyard and examined the garden himself, taking photos with his phone. We'll need to get a sample of the soil and plant material tested to determine what was used. Depending on the substance, this could be anything from simple vandalism to more serious charges involving poisoning or environmental crimes. She's the HOA president, I explained. She's been harassing me for weeks about the garden, claiming it violates rules that do not exist. When the board voted against her proposal to ban vegetable gardens, I guess she decided to take matters into her own hands. The officer nodded. I'll need copies of that video footage, any correspondence you have had with her about the garden, and a written statement from you. We'll also need to contact environmental services to assess whether hazardous materials were used. If she used something like pesticides or industrial herbicides in a residential area without proper licensing, that's a serious violation. I provided everything he requested. Over the next several days, I cooperated fully with the investigation. An environmental specialist came out to test my soil and take samples of the dead plants. The results came back within a week, and they were worse than I had imagined. Brenda had used a combination of industrial-strength herbicide mixed with a soil sterilant typically used for clearing vegetation along railroad tracks and industrial sites. The concentration was so high that my soil would be toxic for growing anything for at least 2 to 3 years without complete remediation. The specialist also noted that the chemicals could potentially leach into neighboring properties and even contaminate groundwater if there was enough rain to wash them deeper into the soil. This is not something you can buy at Home Depot, the environmental specialist, Dr. Sarah Chen, explained to me. This is commercial-grade material that requires special licensing to purchase and use. Using it in a residential area like this is illegal on multiple levels. The police investigation expanded. Detective Lisa Morrison took over the case from Officer Williams, and she was thorough. She obtained Brenda's credit card records with a warrant and found a purchase from an agricultural supply company 3 days before the poisoning. She interviewed the company, which confirmed that Brenda had purchased 2 gallons of industrial herbicide and 1 gallon of soil sterilant, claiming she needed it for a large property management project. Detective Morrison also discovered that Brenda had posted in a private Facebook group for HOA board members, complaining about problem homeowners who refused to follow community standards and asking for advice on creative solutions for dealing with violations. Several members of that group were now being questioned as witnesses. 2 weeks after I first called the police, Detective Morrison called me with an update. "We're moving forward with charges," she said. "Ms. Patterson is being charged with criminal trespassing, vandalism, illegal use of pesticides, and reckless endangerment. The district attorney is also considering additional charges related to environmental crimes because of the nature of the chemicals used and the potential for contamination." "What happens now?" I asked. "She'll be arrested and arraigned. Bail will be set. Then it goes through the court system. You should also know that this is likely going to be a felony case. The illegal pesticide use combined with the reckless endangerment bumps it up from misdemeanor vandalism. She's looking at potential jail time if convicted." I felt a strange mix of vindication and disbelief. I had just wanted to grow some tomatoes in my backyard. Now a woman was facing felony charges because she could not handle not getting her way. Brenda was arrested 3 days later. I heard about it from my neighbor Kevin, who lived 2 doors down and had become friendly over the past few months. "Dude, did you see the cops at Brenda's house this morning?" he asked, stopping by my place after work. "They walked her out in handcuffs. What the hell happened?" I explained the whole situation. Kevin's eyes got wider with each detail. "No way! She actually poisoned your garden? Like, climbed your fence in the middle of the night and dumped chemicals on everything?" "I have it all on video," I said. "The police tested the soil. She used industrial herbicides that are illegal to use in residential areas." Kevin whistled low. "I mean, I knew she was intense about the HOA stuff, but that's actual crazy person behavior. You know, she tried to find me last month because my trash can was visible from the street on a non-trash day. It had blown over in a storm, and I was at work. She wanted me to pay a $100 fine." "That sounds about right," I said. Over the next few days, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some people were shocked and immediately sympathetic to me. Others seemed to think I must have done something to provoke such an extreme reaction, as if that would somehow justify poisoning my property. A few people even suggested I should just drop the charges and let it go because it's just plants. That attitude infuriated me more than almost anything else about the situation. "It's not just plants," I told one neighbor, Margaret, who had stopped by to express her opinion that I was overreacting. "She trespassed on my property at 2 in the morning. She used illegal chemicals that contaminated my soil. She could have affected my neighbors' yards. She could have poisoned groundwater, and she did all of it because she was on a power trip about vegetables." Margaret frowned. "Well, yes, but don't you think felony charges are a bit much? It seems harsh." "She committed felonies," I said flatly. "Multiple ones. If she didn't want to face felony charges, she should not have committed felonies. It's actually pretty straightforward." The emergency HOA meeting that followed Brenda's arrest was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. The remaining board members called a special session to address the situation and determine next steps for leadership. Nearly every homeowner in the development showed up, cramming into the community center meeting room. Robert Chen, the vice president who was now serving as acting president, called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. "I think everyone here is aware that Brenda Patterson was arrested last week on charges related to an incident involving another homeowner's property," he began carefully. "The board has consulted with our attorney, and we have decided that Ms. Patterson's position as president is terminated effective immediately. We will be holding elections for a new president next month." The room erupted in questions and commentary. Robert did his best to maintain order. I know there are a lot of concerns and questions," he said, raising his hands, "but we need to remember that there are legal proceedings happening, and we cannot discuss the details of the case. What I can say is that the board takes this matter very seriously. We are committed to ensuring that all homeowners are treated fairly and that the covenants are enforced consistently and legally." One of the other homeowners, a woman named Patricia, stood up. "I think we need to talk about the culture that allowed this to happen. Brenda was harassing multiple homeowners over petty issues, and the board did nothing to stop her. She was acting like a dictator." Another homeowner, Tom, chimed in. "I got 3 violation notices in 1 month because my lawn was supposedly half an inch too tall. She was measuring people's grass with a ruler." The meeting devolved into a therapy session where nearly everyone shared their own horror stories about Brenda's tenure as president. It turned out I was far from her only target. She had been systematically harassing anyone she perceived as not meeting her personal standards, often issuing violation notices for things that were not actually violations at all. Robert looked exhausted by the end of the meeting. "We hear everyone's concerns. Moving forward, the board will be implementing new checks and balances on the president's authority. No single board member should have the power to issue violation notices without review from at least one other board member. We'll also be revising our violation notice process to include a clearer path for homeowners to dispute notices they believe are unjustified." I left the meeting feeling slightly better about the HOA's future, but still dealing with the very real consequences of Brenda's actions. My garden was destroyed, and my soil was contaminated. The remediation would cost thousands of dollars, and I would not be able to grow anything in that area for years. I filed a civil lawsuit against Brenda for damages. My attorney, James Murphy, was confident we had an airtight case given the video evidence and criminal charges. "The criminal case actually strengthens your civil case significantly," James explained during our consultation. "Once she's convicted, you can use that conviction as evidence in civil court. It's called collateral estoppel. Her criminal conviction will essentially prove liability in your civil case, and then it's just a matter of calculating damages." "What kind of damages can I claim?" I asked. "Property damage for the destroyed plants and contaminated soil, the cost of soil remediation, loss of use of your property, emotional distress, and potentially punitive damages given the intentional and malicious nature of her actions. We're probably looking at somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000, possibly more depending on how much the remediation costs." The number made my head spin, and I had spent maybe $300 on my garden total. But the remediation would be expensive, and the principle of the matter was important to me. Brenda needed to face real consequences for what she had done. The criminal case moved forward steadily. Brenda had initially pled not guilty, and her attorney tried to argue that the security footage was unclear and could have been manipulated. That argument fell apart pretty quickly when the prosecution brought in a digital forensics expert who testified that the footage was authentic and unaltered. They also had the receipt for her chemical purchase, her Facebook posts about problem homeowners, and testimony from the environmental specialist about the severity of the contamination. About 2 months after her arrest, Brenda's attorney approached the prosecutor about a plea deal. The district attorney offered to drop the reckless endangerment charge in exchange for guilty pleas on the trespassing, vandalism, and illegal pesticide use charges. Brenda accepted. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for early July. I was asked to provide a victim impact statement, which I spent several days carefully writing. I wanted to express not just the material damage, but also the emotional impact of having someone violate my property and destroy something I had worked hard to create. The day of the sentencing hearing was hot and humid, typical for a North Carolina summer. I arrived at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse downtown and made my way to the courtroom with James Murphy by my side. Brenda was already there with her attorney, looking significantly less put together than I had ever seen her. Her blonde hair was flat and unstyled, and she wore a simple gray pantsuit that looked like she had borrowed it from someone else. Judge Andrea Thompson presided over the hearing. She was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s with a reputation for being fair but firm. After the preliminary matters were handled and Brenda's guilty pleas were formally entered, the judge asked if I wanted to read my victim impact statement. I stood up, my hands shaking slightly as I held my printed statement. Your Honor, my name is Ethan Anderson. I'm the victim in this case. When I bought my house in Meadowbrook Springs last year, I was excited to finally have space for a garden. I grew up helping my grandmother in her garden, and it has always been something that brings me peace and joy. I spent months carefully planning my vegetable garden, following all the rules and regulations in my HOA covenants. I paused, looking up from my paper to glance at Brenda, who was staring down at the defense table. What Ms. Patterson did was not just vandalism. It was a violation of my home, my safety, and my trust in my community. She climbed my fence in the middle of the night and poisoned my property with dangerous chemicals because she did not like that I was following rules she wished existed but did not. She could have contaminated my neighbor's properties. She could have harmed pets or wildlife. She made a conscious choice to break multiple laws because she felt entitled to control what I did in my own backyard. My voice grew stronger as I continued. The financial damage is significant. The soil remediation alone will cost over $15,000. But beyond that, I have lost years of use of a portion of my property. I have lost the sense of security that comes with knowing your neighbors will respect your boundaries, and I have lost countless hours dealing with this situation instead of living my life. I ask the court to impose a sentence that reflects the seriousness of these crimes and sends a clear message that this behavior is unacceptable. I sat down, my heart pounding. The prosecutor then presented her sentencing recommendation, emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crime and the use of dangerous chemicals. Brenda's attorney tried to argue for leniency, claiming she was under stress from her HOA duties and had made a terrible mistake. Judge Thompson was not impressed. Ms. Patterson, this was not a mistake, the judge said, her voice cutting through the courtroom. A mistake is forgetting to pay a parking ticket or accidentally backing into someone's mailbox. What you did was planned, deliberate, and dangerous. You purchased illegal chemicals, trespassed onto your neighbor's property in the middle of the night, and poisoned his garden because you did not get your way in a homeowners association dispute. Brenda started crying, but the judge continued. You held a position of authority in your community, and you abused that authority. You allowed your personal preferences to override the law and basic decency. The victim impact statement makes clear the significant harm you have caused, and I take that very seriously. The judge sentenced Brenda to 18 months in county jail, with 12 months suspended, meaning she would serve 6 months with the possibility of work release after 90 days. She was also sentenced to 3 years of probation following her release, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to pay full restitution for all damages, including the soil remediation, the destroyed garden, and my legal fees. Additionally, she was permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership position as a condition of her probation. The total restitution came to just over $32,000 when all was said and done. I watched as Brenda was taken into custody, still crying. Her attorney told her something quietly, and she nodded, wiping her eyes. I felt no satisfaction in seeing her led away. I just felt tired and ready for this entire ordeal to be over. Outside the courtroom, Detective Morrison stopped me. Good statement in there. I hope this gives you some closure. Thank you for all your work on this case, I said. I appreciate how seriously you took it. Of course, property crimes might not seem as urgent as violent crimes, but they matter. People have a right to feel safe in their homes, and what she did violated that. I'm glad the judge recognized the severity. James Murphy and I walked back to his office to discuss the civil case. With the criminal conviction secured, the civil lawsuit would be much more straightforward. We can probably settle this pretty quickly now, James said. Her homeowner's insurance might cover some of the civil damages, though they'll likely try to exclude coverage for intentional criminal acts. Either way, we have a judgment for restitution from the criminal case, and we can pursue additional damages in civil court if needed. I just want to be made whole and move on, I said. I don't need to drag this out longer than necessary. Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to return to normal. The HOA held elections, and Robert Chen was elected as the new president along with two new board members who ran on a platform of transparency and reasonable enforcement of actual rules. One of their first acts was to officially clarify in writing that vegetable gardens were permitted as long as they were maintained. The insurance company for the HOA ended up settling with me for the full amount of damages in my civil suit, wanting to avoid further litigation. The money allowed me to hire a professional remediation company to remove the contaminated soil from my backyard and replace it with clean soil. They excavated about 18 inches deep across the entire garden area and hauled away the toxic soil for proper disposal at a hazardous waste facility. It was late August by the time the remediation was complete, and I had fresh, clean soil in my backyard. Too late to plant a summer garden, but I could put in some fall crops. I decided to start small, just some lettuce, spinach, and root vegetables that would tolerate the cooler weather. Kevin came over one evening as I was planting, bringing 2 beers from his fridge. "Garden looks good," he said, handing me a beer. "Different, but good." "Yeah, it's smaller than before. I wanted to ease back into it." "Makes sense. That whole situation was insane. Did you hear Brenda's trying to sell her house?" "I heard. Not surprising. I cannot imagine she'll be welcome back here after everything that happened. Her house has been on the market for 3 weeks and she has not had a single showing. Everyone knows what happened. That story even made the local news." It was true. The local Charlotte news stations had picked up the story, running segments about HOA horror stories and using Brenda's case as an example of HOA power gone wrong. I had declined to be interviewed on camera, but several of my neighbors had spoken to reporters, and the story had gotten a fair amount of attention on social media. "I just hope the new board actually follows through on being reasonable," I said, taking a sip of beer. "So far, so good. Robert seems like a decent guy. And honestly, after everything that happened, I think everyone is going to be watching the board pretty carefully now. Nobody wants a repeat of the Brenda situation." As we stood there in the fading summer light, looking at my newly planted garden, I felt something I had not felt in months. Peace. Yes, I had been through hell. Yes, my garden had been destroyed and my sense of security violated. Yes, I had spent months dealing with police investigations, court proceedings, and remediation projects. But justice had been served. The person who committed crimes against me faced real consequences. The HOA had made meaningful changes to prevent future abuses of power. And I was standing in my backyard, planting vegetables again, which was all I had wanted in the first place. The spinach and lettuce came up beautifully that fall. I planted garlic cloves in October that would overwinter and be ready to harvest the following summer. I started planning for a spring garden, expanding beyond just vegetables to include some native perennials that would attract pollinators. In November, I got a letter from Brenda's attorney. She had been released from jail after serving her full 6 months, having been denied work release due to what the parole board determined was a lack of genuine remorse. The letter was a formal apology, clearly written or at least heavily edited by her lawyer, expressing regret for her actions and acknowledging the harm she had caused. I read it once and filed it away. I appreciated the apology, even if it felt obligatory rather than genuine. But more than an apology, I appreciated that she had actually faced consequences. Too often in HOA disputes, the people in power face no real accountability for their actions. Brenda had learned the hard way that being on a board did not put her above the law. The winter passed quietly. The new HOA board sent out a newsletter in January outlining their vision for the community, which focused on maintaining property values through reasonable enforcement of clear rules while fostering a sense of community rather than antagonism. They organized a neighborhood cleanup day and a summer block party. Small things, but they signaled a different approach than Brenda's reign of petty tyranny. In March, as the weather began to warm, I started my seeds indoors. Tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, and this time I added eggplant and cucumbers. I had also decided to build raised beds for the vegetable garden, which would make maintenance easier and create a more intentional design. I spent several weekends constructing 4 large cedar raised beds, filling them with a mixture of the remediated soil, compost, and peat moss. When I transplanted my seedlings in mid-April, exactly 1 year after my original garden had been poisoned, I felt emotional in a way I had not expected. This garden represented more than just growing food. It represented resilience. It represented standing up for yourself when someone tries to bully you. It represented the principle that rules should be applied fairly and that no one, not even people in positions of authority, is above the law. My neighbor from across the street, an older woman named Dorothy who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, came over to admire the new raised beds. "This looks wonderful, Ethan," she said warmly. "I'm so glad you didn't let that awful business stop you from gardening." "Thanks, Dorothy. It was tempting to just give up and put in boring shrubs, but I couldn't let her win like that." "Good for you. You know, I've been gardening in this neighborhood longer than anyone, and I never understood why Brenda had such a problem with your vegetables. Vegetables are plants just like anything else. They're beautiful when they're growing." "I think it was more about control than actual aesthetics," I said. She wanted to dictate what people did with their own property, regardless of what the rules actually said. Well, she certainly learned her lesson. 6 months in jail. I still can barely believe it came to that. I can barely believe she poisoned my garden in the first place. That's not normal behavior. Dorothy nodded sagely. Power does strange things to people, even small amounts of power like running an HOA. As spring progressed into summer, my garden thrived. The tomatoes grew heavy with fruit. The pepper plants produced abundantly. The zucchini did what zucchini always does and threatened to take over the world. I had more vegetables than I could eat, so I started bringing bags of produce to my neighbors. Kevin became my regular recipient of surplus zucchini. "Dude, I appreciate it, but I'm running out of ways to cook this stuff," he joked as I handed him another massive zucchini in late June. "Make bread, make fritters, grill it, spiralize it into noodles," I suggested, "or just leave it on someone else's doorstep in the middle of the night." "That's how zucchini exchange works in the suburbs, right? Like a vegetable version of Ding Dong Ditch?" I laughed, and it felt good. The whole situation had been so stressful and dark for so long that being able to laugh about gardens again felt like a real milestone. The 1-year anniversary of Brenda's arrest came and went without fanfare. I marked it privately by making a large batch of tomato sauce from my garden tomatoes and inviting a few neighbors over for pasta. Robert and his wife came, along with Kevin, Dorothy, and a few other people from the street. We ate on my back deck, looking out over the thriving garden. "To surviving HOA drama," Kevin said, raising his wine glass. "To reasonable rules and reasonable enforcement," Robert added. "To gardens," I said simply, "and to good neighbors." We all drank to that. Later that evening, after everyone had left and I was cleaning up, I stood on my deck looking at the garden in the fading light. Lightning bugs were starting to emerge, their small lights blinking among the tomato plants. The air smelled like summer. Warm soil, tomato leaves, and the jasmine blooming on the fence. A year ago, I'd been in the middle of a nightmare, dealing with police investigations and criminal charges and contaminated soil. Now I was standing in my backyard, pleasantly full of homemade pasta and good wine, looking at a thriving garden that I had rebuilt from literally poisoned ground. The experience had taught me several important lessons. First, documentation matters. Without those security cameras, I would have had no proof of what Brenda did, and she likely would have gotten away with it. Second, standing up for yourself is worth it, even when it's difficult and stressful. If I had just let it go or backed down when she started harassing me about the garden, she would have continued to abuse her power with me and other homeowners. Third, community matters. The support I received from neighbors like Kevin and Dorothy made the whole ordeal more bearable. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the nature of rules and authority. Rules are meant to create order and fairness, not to give petty tyrants tools for harassment. Authority is a responsibility, not a license for control. And when people abuse positions of power, there need to be real consequences, or nothing ever changes. Brenda served her time, paid her restitution, and as far as I knew, moved out of state to live with family. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was working retail somewhere in Florida, far from any HOA board positions. I felt no particular animosity toward her at this point. She had made her choices and faced the consequences. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, though I would never know if she really had. As for me, I continued to garden. I expanded my raised beds the following spring, adding 2 more for a total of 6. I experimented with different varieties and techniques. I started composting and built a small greenhouse for starting seeds. The garden became a central feature of my backyard, and far from bringing down property values as Brenda had claimed, several neighbors mentioned that it had inspired them to start their own vegetable gardens. The HOA under Robert's leadership turned out to be exactly what it should have been all along, a functional organization that maintained common areas, enforced reasonable rules fairly, and stayed out of homeowners' business unless there was a legitimate issue. Violation notices became rare, and when they were issued, they were for actual violations with clear documentation and a reasonable path to resolution. I served on the landscaping committee for a year, helping to update the covenant language to be clearer and more specific about what was and was not allowed. We explicitly added language confirming that vegetable gardens were permitted, along with fruit trees, composting bins, and other sustainable landscaping practices, as long as they were maintained and did not create hazards or nuisances. 3 years after the incident, I was harvesting tomatoes one Saturday morning when a young couple walked by with a realtor, clearly looking at a house for sale down the street. They stopped to admire the garden. "Wow, this is beautiful," the woman said. "Are vegetable gardens allowed here? We love to garden." "Absolutely," I said, walking over to the fence with a handful of cherry tomatoes. "Want to try some? These are Sun Gold variety, really sweet." They each took a tomato, and their faces lit up when they tasted them. "Wow, these are incredible," the man said. "Way better than store-bought." "That's the magic of homegrown," I said. "If you end up buying in the neighborhood, I'm happy to share tips on what grows well here. The soil is good and the sun exposure is excellent for most properties." "Is the HOA pretty reasonable?" the woman asked. "We've heard horror stories about some HOAs around Charlotte." I paused, considering how to answer honestly without scaring them off from what was actually a good neighborhood now. "The HOA here is very reasonable now," I said carefully. "There was an issue a few years ago with overly aggressive enforcement, but that got resolved and the current board is great. They focus on the important stuff and don't micromanage. I've been very happy here." The realtor, who had been standing back listening, nodded. "Meadowbrook Springs has really turned around its reputation in the last few years. It's become one of the more desirable neighborhoods in this area." After they walked away, I thought about that phrase. Turned around its reputation. That was a tactful way of saying, recovered from having a president who went to jail for poisoning a resident's garden. But it was true. The neighborhood had moved past that dark chapter and built something better. I finished harvesting my tomatoes, along with several peppers and a handful of green beans. I had more than enough for dinner, so I packed up some extras in a basket and walked over to Dorothy's house. She answered the door with a smile. "Ethan! What a nice surprise. Garden is producing like crazy right now. Thought you might like some fresh tomatoes and peppers." "Oh, how wonderful. Come in, come in. I just made lemonade." I followed her into her kitchen, and we spent a pleasant half-hour chatting about gardening, the neighborhood, and life in general. These small moments of community, I realized, were what made a neighborhood truly good. Not perfect lawns and uniform mailboxes, but neighbors who knew each other and looked out for each other. As I walked back home in the late afternoon sun, I felt a deep sense of contentment. My garden was thriving. My neighborhood was peaceful. Justice had been served, and life had moved on. The whole experience had been traumatic and stressful, but I'd come through it stronger and more connected to my community. That evening, I grilled vegetables from my garden and sat on my deck eating dinner as the sun set. The garden stretched out before me, lush and productive, and proof that good things can grow even from poisoned ground if you are willing to do the work to heal it. I never heard from Brenda again, and I was fine with that. Her chapter in my life and in our neighborhood story was closed. The raised beds I had built on the exact spot where she had poured those toxic chemicals were now producing food that I shared with neighbors and friends. The soil that had been sterilized and dead was now alive with earthworms and beneficial microbes. Life, as it tends to do, had found a way forward. Years later, when people asked me about the incident, as they occasionally did when the story came up, I tried to frame it not as a story about revenge or punishment, but as a story about accountability and resilience. Yes, Brenda faced serious consequences for her actions, including jail time and a felony record. But the real victory was not her punishment. The real victory was that the system worked. The police took my complaint seriously. The evidence was properly investigated. The courts imposed appropriate consequences, and the community learned from the experience and made positive changes. In a way, Brenda's crimes had exposed weaknesses in the HOA structure that needed to be addressed. Her trial and conviction had prompted serious conversations about HOA governance, not just in Meadowbrook Springs but in developments across Charlotte. Several HOAs revised their bylaws to include better checks and balances on board authority. Local news coverage of the case had made homeowners more aware of their rights and more willing to push back against unreasonable enforcement. So while I would never be grateful that my garden was poisoned, I could recognize that something positive had ultimately come from it. And every time I harvested vegetables from that soil that had literally been brought back to life after being poisoned, I was reminded that recovery is possible and growth can happen even in the most unlikely circumstances. My garden, rebuilt on poisoned ground, thriving despite everything that had happened to it, was the perfect metaphor for resilience. And as I sat there on my deck, watching the last light fade from the sky and the lightning bugs begin their nightly dance among the tomato plants, I felt truly at peace with how everything had turned out. The garden grew, the neighborhood healed, justice was served, and life, beautiful and messy and complicated and good, went on.